Relay, we're covering today's top boxing news.
Sometimes you set the standard for everyone to catch up to, but there's no one to push you on. So, you know, for a long time, she set the standard, but what happens is people just catch up.
What about fighting in Dublin at Croke Park?
Every time I fought it, the whole of Ireland hates me for a day, and then the next day they're back. Oh,
they took over the Excel during the Olympics, didn't
they?
In Ireland, yeah.
So yeah, I love Ireland. You know, Liverpool's got a big Irish contingency in itself, and yeah, it'd be what a fight it'd be, and what a venue.
Well, obviously, that's always a good fight. They'll talk about Croke Park. I say Anfield. So there's that there. There's a rivalry there. There's a fight there.
Would you back her to be closer on the scorecards this time?
I should stop Katie Taylor this time.
Stop her?
Yeah, stop Katie Taylor. No, that's definitely.
Well, there you go.
No, definitely. And it isn't me. People in the trade, everything. Katie, she's a legend back in Ireland, and she's a great thing. But even the first time I thought she was beginning to have a little bit of a slide on her, and that's why people are talking Croke Park, and they weren't talking about the performance last time. I do feel Natasha, with the confidence now and the authority and the belief in becoming a world champion, the way that she carries herself and everything, it's just about time. And I think that's why Natasha doesn't get mentioned on the other side for a fight with Katie, because she comes so very close to winning last time.
I don't think Joe's being completely honest with himself. A part of the reason I think Natasha doesn't get mentioned for a potential Katie Taylor fight, rematch I should say, is because Natasha's over there on Boxer.
She made a decision to leave Matchroom and migrate over to Boxer on Sky, and for what it's worth, I actually think she made the right decision, but in doing so...
At least in the minds of a lot of people, she took herself out of the running for a Katie Taylor fight, because if Katie Taylor's who you want, why would you go to Boxer?
She's with Matchroom.
So were you, up until recently. Does Natasha Jonas stop Katie Taylor in a second fight, in a rematch?
There has to be one for us to get the answer to that question.
I'm not sure that there will. The boxing world is still reacting to Natasha Jonas' sentiments towards a Terry Harper rematch, a Terry Harper sequel, a more competitive fight for my money than the Katie Taylor fight was.
By far, and why?
Some of you out there seem to think that Natasha Jonas is outright ducking Terry Harper. I've seen the reactions. I've seen the sentiments expressed, and I can't say that I agree with them, because Natasha Jonas, in the minds of a lot of people...
Not all, but some. She won the Harper fight, and she was robbed of a decision. There are a lot of people that feel that way.
Even if you, as an individual, don't, there are a lot of people that feel that way. And it's not like Natasha Jonas has been coasting on Easy Street since the Harper fight. She shared the ring with Katie Taylor. She went all the way up there to junior middleweight.
She's fighting women that are naturally bigger than she is. She beat 2 champions up there.
Became a Unified Ring Magazine and lineal champion, all in this calendar year. I don't think for a second Natasha is afraid of a Terry Harper rematch. I don't think fear...
It's not fear, it's hard feelings. Fear doesn't even come into it.
When I spoke to young Natasha Jonas last week, she made it clear that she doesn't have an issue with Matchroom. Matchroom is a promotional outfit per se, and here today we see that they're willing to work with Matchroom for some other fights, just not that one.
I wrestle with the idea that Natasha Jonas is ducking Terry Harper. Ducking.
I can't say that I agree with that sentiment, even though I wholeheartedly understand the desire to see those 2 champions run it back. I think that fight deserves a sequel more than Taylor versus Jonas does. I do.
Steffi Bull, who handles the career of young Terry Harper, reacted to this news by saying, the week after the first fight, Terry Harper signed a new 5-fight deal. Fight 1, Katarina Thanders.
Mandatory that ended up going to purse bids. At that time, Terry Harper wasn't at liberty to take on Natasha for a second time without surrendering her green belt, surrendering her WBC title. She had to fight Katarina Thanders because Katarina was her mandatory. Fight 2 would have been a Jonas rematch. Fight 3 would have been Hyun Mi Choi.
The sentiment expressed from Team Jonas is, there was an opportunity there to do an immediate rematch, to do an immediate second fight, but because that didn't happen and because of the way that Natasha was treated, they're not receptive to a rematch anymore.
What Steffi's saying in so many words is they were not at liberty at that time to do an immediate second fight. However, Terry signed for a rematch a week after. She's always wanted to fight. Team Jonas are the ones that didn't sign.
She was willing to do the rematch, it just wouldn't be immediately after the first fight. That's what it was.
In any event, it doesn't look like any progress is being made. From the time that I spoke to Natasha, a little over a week ago, till now, it's not looking encouraging for that rematch, for that undisputed junior middleweight title fight. And attention now turns to a potential Jonas versus Taylor rematch.
I kind of feel like For putting Katie in there with Natasha again, a boxer fighter, Matchroom might elect to put Katie in there with Chantel Cameron, who's always wanted that fight, and it's an in-house situation. She's an in-house fighter.
Why would they let that opportunity go to a fighter that decided to leave their promotional banner when they've got a fighter right there, an unbeaten one, who's always wanted this fight?
Stands to reason.
Matchroom still has control of most of the belts from 130 to 147 pounds.
Natasha expressed an interest in potentially moving down in weight to take on Jessica McCaskill, but I think that Rick Ramos has since blown off that idea.
Chantel Cameron has stated that she's willing to run it back with Jessica, just at 147 instead of 140. The bottom line here is...
No, I don't think Natasha's afraid of Terry. She just doesn't want to give her the satisfaction, though at the same time, she does have limited options, doesn't she?
Because she has such limited options at or around these weights, perhaps she should come around to the idea of facing Terry again. There's a demand for the fight. There's a lot of prestige, a lot of legacy.
There's no guarantee you can get a second Katie Taylor fight.
Men's welterweight news ahead of what is to be the Errol Spence Jr. versus Keith Thurman showdown. Former champion Shawn Porter doesn't like Thurman's chances in possible Spence bout. Good. Can't beat great.
That's assuming Keith Thurman is even good anymore. I don't think he is.
I don't think he's good, let alone great.
Well, in truth, I don't think Errol Spence Jr. is all that great either.
Honestly, I think my heart wants to say that Keith, it's a really good alternative, said Porter to FightHype.com recently. I think it all just depends on Keith. He is in the latter stages of his career. I just know from experience, and I know from what I've seen from other fighters for so long, the energy and everything that you gave. Boxing. Early in your career, the middle of your career, it's just much different than it is on the back end of your career. Once viewed as one of the brighter stars in the sport, Thurman solidified himself as the man to beat following consecutive victories over Sean Portier and Danny Garcia. But while the now 33-year-old began basking underneath the pugilistic spotlight, his career took a turn for the worse.
Keith Thurman, the last 6 years, 4 out of those 6 years were spent away from the sport.
You heard that right. When you put those 2-year intervals, those 2-year intermittent intervals of inactivity, the one after the Danny Garcia fight and the one more recently after the Pacquiao fight, that comes out to about roughly 4 years of inactivity. Yeesh. Unable to remain healthy for a protracted period, Thurman, 30 wins with just 1 loss and 22 knockouts, has spent most of his time watching the sport from a distance. After being forced to miss nearly 3 years due to the injury bug, the former unified champion returned to the ring against Mario Barrios earlier this year. While he may have picked up the win, Porter admits that he was far from impressed.
There's nothing impressive about that performance.
Having hung up his gloves for good in November of 2021, Porter spends most of his time analyzing his former contemporaries. In doing so, the former 2-time titleist is now under the impression that Thurman has lost a step. If the Clearwater, Florida native intends to spring the upset against Spence, Porter is convinced that he'll need to turn back the clock considerably.
And having fought only once this year, way back there in February, that won't help him do that.
It's widely understood that the more you do something, the better you become at it. But having fought only once in close to 3 years...
Once.
Just once.
And with the Errol Spence Jr. fight set to go down in February of next year.
That's approximately a year's time between fights. Approximately a year between the Mario Barrios fight of earlier this year and the proposed Errol Spence Jr. showdown in February of next year.
Keith Thurman is not an elite fighter anymore. Maybe there was a time when he was, but that time, those days have long since passed.
Errol Spence is a great fighter, and good can't beat great. Once upon a time, Keith was great. The question is, does he still have it in him? Based on his last fight, long way from the lip to the cup.
I know that's right.
It just looks like he's got a lot of work to do in order to get back to being a supreme athletic talent. And I reiterate, Keith Thurman, in spite of what he was, that's not who he is. Not here today. The idea that because Keith Thurman has only ever lost 1 professional contest, 1 professional bout.
There's more to boxing than what you see on paper.
Perhaps the reason that Keith Thurman has only lost 1 professional bout is because 4 out of the last 6 years, he spent them away from the sport. If he were fighting, he might have racked up even more losses. Opposite the ring, an Amon Tustanionis, a Radzav Butaev, an Errol Spence, a Terrence Crawford, a Jaron Boots Ennis, or a Virgil Ortiz. Keith don't win!
He doesn't
beat anybody good. He doesn't beat anybody with a pulse. in today's welterweight division. And there are boxing fans who view a fighter like Keith Thurman with blinders on. They view him through a filter. This ain't 2016 or 2017 anymore. And just because he's a familiar face or a familiar name doesn't mean that here today he's an elite fighter. Elite fighters don't go 12 rounds with Mario Barrios.
Because Mario Barrios is an elite fighter. Not at 147 pounds, not coming off a knockout loss at 140 to 135 pounder.
Oh, that might sound obvious to you, but it needs to be said. Because there are those out there who would remove all context from the conversation and tell you about the fighter that Keith Thurman used to be instead of telling you about the fighter that he is. If Terrence Crawford went 12 rounds with Mario Barrios, what would people say?
Keith Thurman did earlier this year in February, and there are still people out there that want me and you to believe that this is an elite fighter, an elite talent.
Not based on activity or accolades, not based on anything he's been doing, but things he used to be able to do that I don't think he can do anymore. This guy don't win a belt from nobody at 147 pounds.
You probably think I'm being too hard on Keith Thurman, but how many different ways can I say that this guy ain't what he used to be?
How many polite ways are there really for me to say that this guy's far too inactive?
I mean, you lost to a 40-year-old Manny Pacquiao in 2019, took off the subsequent 2 years, then came back against a 140-pounder.
That guy was coming off a knockout loss at 140. You fought him at 147. You didn't land on that guy by accident.
And sitting out the rest of this year, that wasn't an accident either, whether it was due to more injuries or just the scarcity of resources.
I mean, if Keith Thurman wanted to improve his chances against Errol Spence Jr., he could have squeezed in 1 or 2 more fights, or he should have, but he didn't.
Maybe Showtime just ain't got the resources. They ain't got the money to get these fighters out there in a calendar year, but so many times in a calendar year. Maybe that's what it was.
Fox is said to be leaving the sport of boxing after this year, but for whatever reason, Keith Thurman only fought once. The bottom line is, he only fought once in the last close to 3 years.
Sat out all of 2020, sat out all of 2021, only fought once this year.
You know that most of those supposed elite welterweights on PBC Island, they're on practically the same schedule of inactivity. You know, Danny sat out all of last year, Errol sat out all of last year, so did Keith.
All 3 have only fought once in the last 2 years.
The idea that you can stay sharp enough to be an elite level fighter on a schedule like that is farce.
Nonsense.
There are people out there talking up Keith Thurman as an opponent for Errol for the simple fact that they're just big fans of Errol. The reality...
I'm gonna sign off on whatever he does and whoever he fights, when what I see, the powers that be, they moved heaven and earth to ensure that Errol Spence shares the ring with the weakest link.
Irrespective of a Crawford fight, there were 2 other guys hot on Errol's trail. Jaron Boots Ennis by way of the IBF and a Montestanionis by way of the WBA. Keith Thurman, he don't beat either of those guys, and he don't beat Errol either.
He's the weakest link.
It's no coincidence he got to skip ahead in the queue ahead of those 2 aforementioned fighters.
He's the weakest link.
When Sean Porter says that good don't beat great, well, that's an understatement.
Because we don't even know if Keith Thurman's good anymore. I don't think he is.
And finally, Gilberto Ramirez on his first professional loss to Dimitri Bivol recently. It has been hard to accept. I will come back stronger.
It's hard to know what Zurdo is going to do next. Will he continue to campaign as a light heavyweight, mount another world title run?
Or will he move up in weight? Ramirez, a former WBO world champion at super middleweight, suffered the first loss of his career and must now work his way back to another world title opportunity. Initially, Ramirez refused to acknowledge the loss and told reporters that he felt that he did enough to win. After reviewing things, Ramirez has backed away from that position. It just wasn't my night. Congratulations to the champion, Ramirez said, gracious in defeat.
Now he is.
Zurdo Ramirez has always been rather statuesque for super middleweight and even light heavyweight, an advantage that seemed to work for him up until this point, because that's just one of those things that works up until it doesn't. This is boxing, folks. Size and size alone, while it does matter, it can be worked around.
Well, I understand that some mountains are too high to climb depending on what the circumstances are, but Zurdo's biggest advantage is that he's a really big guy.
That by itself won't always do the job, won't always be enough. This result has been difficult to accept, but I promise to come back stronger and better from the bottom of my heart. I sincerely appreciate all of the love and support throughout this journey. Ramirez's record dropped to 44-1 with 30 wins by way of knockout. It remains to be seen if Ramirez will continue at 175 pounds or if he intends to once again climb up in weight to cruiserweight.
It's a lopsided fight.
I picked Dimitri Bivol to win by way of a points decision ahead of the match, but I didn't expect that he would be as dominant as he was against Zurdo. I have to admit, I expected a lot more from Zurdo than what I got. Dimitri putting Zurdo on his back foot, timing his entry with the lead hand, with the jab.
He didn't circle away from Zurdo. He didn't try to put distance between himself and Zurdo. He stayed in the pocket with him, staying on top of him, and forced him back, forced him onto his back foot, where Zurdo's no good.
It was a boxing lesson if I ever saw one. In and out on the balls of his feet, in and out on his toes. Dimitri Bivol stayed with and stayed on top of Zurdo Ramirez while simultaneously offsetting his aggression, not allowing him to get anything going. And you have to wonder, behind a performance like that, will Zurdo continue to campaign as a light heavyweight, or will he move up to cruiserweight where perhaps the guys aren't as cerebral as Dimitri Bivol
Oh, no, they're not cerebral, but he won't have a size advantage up there either. Opposite the ring of Lorenzo Coley, opposite the ring of Jay Opataya.
Those guys could give Zurdo Ramirez a lot of problems. Now, maybe he'd have more luck with a more crude boxer like a Lunga Makabu or the sparsely active Arsene Goulamarian, who very recently returned to action after over 2 years of inactivity. That division's WBA champion. Maybe Zurdo would have more luck with those guys, but there are still perils.
Zurdo at his best is a mid-range to inside pressure fighter and a volume puncher. You stand in front of those guys for too long.
The way you did those super middleweights, the way you did some of those light heavyweights, you do that with them and you might find out real fucking fast.
You ain't got a size advantage anymore.
Curious to see what Zurdo Ramirez will decide to do. Will he decide to stay at light heavyweight, have a couple of fights, get himself back in world title contention after things in the world title picture clear up? Because there are only 2 champions at light heavyweight and they're busy.
Bivol just beat you in our tour. He's going to fight Anthony Yard early next year.
I mean, maybe Zurdo can get in the ring with a Joe Smith Jr., you know, a Craig Richards.
A Joshua Buatsi, a Callum Smith.
Keep busy with those guys and fight in fights that people want to see, even if there's not an alphabet title on the line. He can do that for a while.
As a light heavyweight, he can, or he can go up to cruiserweight. Try his chances up there.
One loss doesn't have to be the end of the world, you know.
I don't know. We'll see what he decides to do next year.